Hi, welcome to the review video for the first Bakiyut exam. This is going to be a very basic overview of the material. First, we have the very first Mishnah on Bet Amud Aleph. This is the Mishnah that I think you're all most familiar with. It describes the dates on which Megillah can be read, the 11th through 15th. Talks about moving Kfarim earlier to the Yom HaKnesah. Talks about reading on the 14th versus the 15th for walled versus unwalled cities, and then gives all the cases of how it might play out when the different cities might read, depending on when Yud Daled Be'adar falls out. And you should be familiar with all those different cases, especially the anomalies like Shabbat and Erev Shabbat. Then the Gemara starts by talking about the words Megillah Nigreit B'Yud Aleph, that the Megillah may be read as early as the 11th, and asks Minalan, from where do we know this? And the Gemara first sort of challenges us. What do you mean, how do we know this? We know because we have a statement later in the Gemara that the rabbis allowed the Kfarim to move it earlier. But then we also restate the question and say, well, who actually established all these dates? That's what we want to know. Okay, it must have been the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, because it must have been, couldn't be that we changed things after the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, but where do we see it in the Megillah? The Gemara revises the question to Heicha Remiza, where do we see this hinted to in the text? And the Gemara has two basic answers. One is the Kayamim Hapurim Ha'ela Bizmanehem, that verse, and the other is Kayamim Asher Nachu Behem Hayudim, that's the verse that means that implies all these dates. Then the Gemara goes on to talk about the attribution of the Mishnah. That's sort of the second topic. That our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Akiva, Zodivi Rabbi Akiva Stim Ta'a. But the rabbis believe that you could only read Megillah on the 14th and the 15th. We have a contradiction from Rabbi Yehuda, Breitza by Rabbi Yehuda, who says that actually that only applies when the years are as they are supposed to be, meaning being established by witness and all the Jews are living in Israel. But nowadays, because we have a fixed calendar and Purim and Pesach have to match, so nowadays we only read Megillah on the 14th and 15th. The Gemara struggles with this a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't seem to match either our Mishnah or the Chachamim. Then we have this contradictory Breitza, which we believe at first is from Rabbi Yehuda, right? That's Rav Ashi's Kasha. Another Breitza that also limits when villages can move the reading earlier, and says that it's only in a time and place when the villages actually go in on Monday and Thursday, but if they don't, then you don't move the reading earlier. And we resolve that contradiction by saying that one Breitza is actually Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and the other is Rabbi Yehuda. So that works out fine. Then we start with the next, analyzing the next line in the Mishnah. That cities that have been walled from the times of Yehoshua read on the 15th. Minahani Milei. That's the Gemara's question. From where do we know this? From where are these words? So Rava gives this verse, Al Ken HaYehudim HaPrazim HaYoshvim Ba'arei HaPrazot, and explores that. Really, the Megillah only talks about reading really only explicitly talks about the Prazim and reading on the 14th, but because it says Et Yom Arba'a Asar Ve Yom Chamisha Asar, you read on the 14th and the 15th, so it must be that the Mukfin Choma read on the 15th. The Gemara learns that out, right? It can't be that the walled cities don't read at all and they can't read on the same day, and we have a mention of the 15th, so it must be that they read on the 15th. That's my quick summary. And that section finishes up with this line, Ashkechan Asiya Zachira Minalan, finishes up with this question that we find Asiya mentioned in the Megillah doing the acts of Purim, but how do we know about Zechira, about mentioning, actually reading the Megillah? And the answer is Hayamim Ha'ela Nizkarim V'Na'asim Idkash Zechira L'Asiya. Zechira and Asiya are connected, are compared. There's a comparison between the two, so whenever you do one, you do the other. Then we launch into a discussion of the position of Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, who disagrees with our Mishnah and says that it's actually not cities that were walled from the days of Yehoshua ben Nun, but cities that were walled from the days of Achashverosh, which might make more sense, but we don't actually accept that. So we explain each of their reasonings. Rabbi Yeshua's just makes sense because, Achashverosh, and our Tana Didan, the Tana of our Mishnah, learns out Prazi. There's a verse in Esther that connects to a verse in Yehoshua, so that's the Yehoshua connection. And the Gemara also discusses why Shushan might have a special status. Shushan, when was it walled? Discusses that. But Shushan might have a special status also because the miracle was done there. The miracle actually happened there. And the Gemara continues to discuss these two different positions. and ultimately, again, we do paskin that you read that it's walled cities from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. And the Gemara explores this pasuk, Medina ve'ir va'ir, explores the implications for Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, explores the implications for the Tana of our Mishnah, and also this opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that says that it just teaches us that everything next to a city, within a mile of the city, is considered part of that city. Okay. Then we started with this section, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. This kicks off the section about Menatzpach, and we get into translations of text. So Menatzpach are the Otiot Sofiot, the ones that change when they're at the ends of words. Sofim Amrim, they were said by the Nevi'im. The Gemara then explores this issue of whether Nevi'im can actually change something. The upshot is Nevi'im can't change things, but if something was forgotten, they might reinstitute it. Then we get up to the next Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. This one is specifically about the translations. Onkelos Hager translated the Torah. The Nevi'im were translated by Yonatan ben Uziel. God got a little upset, but Yonatan ben Uziel said, no, it's really a good thing. It's really for you, God. But then God would not allow Yonatan ben Uziel to translate Tuvim because Idbei Ketz, because there was information about Mashiach there. That's Idbei Ketz Mashiach, right? There's information about Mashiach there. We're not going to allow you to translate it and give away God's secrets. Then there's a challenge to the idea that Onkelos actually translated the Torah. They discussed that, again, we don't want to say that that things, the translations didn't exist, or that any part of the text, the Masoretic text, wasn't given originally, but maybe Onkelos just found it again and reestablished it. There's an example of how important Targum actually is, because Rabbi Yosef says, well, if it weren't for the Targum, I'd never understand this particular verse in Zechariah. And then we have this little piece about a verse from Sefer Daniel, which the upshot is that sometimes your mazal sees things that you don't, and that might scare you, but you should say Kriyat Shema or say something about a fat goat, and it will scare away the bad guys. Vehashta, that's our next section, starts after the two dots. We're now on Gimel Amud Aleph. So we've already said what Medina ve'ir va'ir means. We go back to the end of that pasuk, Mishpacha Mishpacha, and we explain that means that you can leave almost anything from Megillah Rini. You could leave behind the Mishpachot Kuna Leviah. You can leave behind temple service, and you can also leave behind Torah learning. So Mikra Megillah trumps both of those. Then we have a story about Yehoshua. Yehoshua, in Sefer Yehoshua, we have a story that proves that also that Torah learning is more important. In this case, the Torah learning is more important than Avodah. It's not about Megillah reading, but the implication of the story, with a little aside about meeting and talking to an angel, the implication of the story is that Torah reading is more important, that Torah learning is more important than Avodat Beit HaMikdash. That story continues on to Gimel Amud Bet, and then we have a section about the importance of Torah learning. The Torah learning of Rabim is more important than Torah learning of a Yachid, and Torah learning of Rabim is more important in general. We have this piece about being able to mourn for Talmidei Chachamim on Chol Moed, even though generally you can't mourn on Chol Moed. And then we get into a more general discussion of priorities, of what is adif, what is preferable, or what takes precedence. And the upshot is that Met Mitzvah takes precedence over just about everything, everything that we have listed here anyway. We learned it out from this pasuk in Bamidbar about Vila Achoto. And again, Met Mitzvah trumps Avodat Beit HaMikdash, it trumps Torah learning, and it even trumps Mikra Megillah. You should take care of a Met Mitzvah rather than do any of these other things, and the reason that's given is Mishum Kavod HaBriot, because of showing honor to living creatures. So that is the conclusion of that section. Gufa, Amar Yeshua ben Levi. We go back to the statement of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that a city and everything that's adjacent to it and everything that can be seen from it is treated as part of the city. The Gemara goes on to say that this means it's an either or. Either it can be seen from the city or it's adjacent to the city, but doesn't have to be both in order to count as part of the city. Another statement of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi about a krach that was, built and presumably walled, and then it was destroyed. Both of it didn't have the wall, and then it had the wall later, and if it was built and then destroyed, and then reestablished. So it discusses Batei Rechama in this context. This verse from Vayikra that we've seen a few times. So it has to have a wall. It has to have 10 batlanin, 10 people who don't do anything. We're going to see more about those later. And the Gemara says that charav is charav me'asara batlanin, is that it was destroyed from asara batlanin. It didn't have those anymore. It has to have those in order to count as a big city. That's this whole section. Again, just talking about what defines a big city. We have some examples of cities here that were built and then destroyed and then rebuilt. I wouldn't worry too much about the details. Just, again, that it supports Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's general statement about cities that were built and destroyed and then rebuilt. Another statement of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, women are obligated in Mikra Megillah because they too were included in that miracle. That's here. And again, we discussed the position of Rashi that this means that women also were going to be destroyed, and they too were saved. Tosfot has a different opinion about women being instrumental in the miracle. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also says that Purim that falls out on Shabbat, you have to learn about Inyano Shel Yom. You learn about Purim, right? We don't read Megillah, but we do learn about Purim. We could do that in all sorts of ways, having Divrei Torah, having classes, having discussions, not necessarily reading Megillah. And the Gemara says, well, actually, that's true for all holidays. Moshe made that enactment, right? Moshe tiken lahem Yisrael, that all those holidays, why just Purim? So the Gemara answers why it specifies Purim. You needed to know that because we do have this Gzera of Rabbah against reading Megillah on Purim. You might have thought that applied to all learning, but it does not. Then another statement from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, we have to read Megillah twice on Purim, and there are two verses that prove this. This one from Tehillim, Elokai Ekra Yomam V'lo Ta'anev Lo Dumi Ali, and the other proof down here, L'man Yizmerach Kavod V'lo Yudom Hashem Elokai Le'olam Adeka. The Gemara then moves on to the next phrase from the Mishnah, Ela Shakfarim Makdimin Liyom HaKnisa. This discusses the fact that famous kula, that famous leniency that allows the kfarim to read earlier, and discusses for whose benefit that might be. We're now starting Dalet Amud Bet. And the Gemara concludes that it's actually for the benefit of the kfarim themselves, not for the benefit of the cities as we initially thought. Next statement in the Mishnah, Ketzad, how does this work? Right, the enumeration of all the different cases, if the 14th falls out on this day versus on this day, and the Gemara asks why the beginning of the Mishnah uses days of the week, and the beginning of the Mishnah uses the days of the month, the dates, and the second part of the Mishnah uses the days of the week, and it says because otherwise you would get confused. And I think this is because in Hebrew we say the dates. We say both days and dates with numbers, right? Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni. So it would just be too confusing, so it had to give you days of the week in the second part. Chali Be'erev Shabbat, the Mishnah then goes on to talk about what happens if Purim falls out on Friday. And the Gemara asks, Matnitin Mani, who does our Mishnah match with? It discusses Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, because we have a Breita with these two opinions, Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi. And it turns out that Rebbe is the position that best matches our Mishnah, and there's a discussion of the verse B'chol Shana V'Shana. And here we had this conversation about priorities, how you're going to arrange things when you can't have them in their quote-unquote normal way, where cities read on the 14th and walled cities read on the 15th. You have to rearrange things, and different Tanaim have different priorities, whether it means you always want to have the walled cities after the big cities, or always keep the big cities on the 14th. That's the discussion that happens here. And we figure out the reasoning for each Rabbi Yossi and Rebbe, but again, Rebbe ultimately is the one who matches our Mishnah best. Okay. And we have a statement from Rabbi Chabal in the name of Rav Huna, also about Purim that falls out on Shabbat. We sort of transition from talking about Purim that falls out on Erev Shabbat to Purim that falls out on Shabbat. Again, you don't need to worry about whose opinion is whose too much. But just be familiar with the basic flow of the conversation here. Okay, Okay, now we're moving on again to discussing Shabbat. Techuli alma miha Megillah b'Shabbat lo karinan, my tama. Everyone agrees that we don't read Megillah on Shabbat. Why? So there are two reasons given. One is the one we're already familiar with, that Rabbah says that can't read Megillah on Shabbat because you might come to carry. And the other reason is given by Rav Yosef, that we always give Matzanot Levyonim when we read Megillah, and we can't give Matzanot Levyonim on Shabbat, so we can't read Megillah on Shabbat. Those are the two reasons for not reading Megillah on Shabbat. Okay, we're going to turn the page, as it were, to Hey Amud Aleph. So Megillah reading gets pushed off, but what about Simcha? That happens in its proper date, right? The other mitzvot of Megillah don't have to be moved. Rav and Rav Asi then have a disagreement about whether or not you need 10 for the reading of Megillah. Rav says Megillah bismana korino ta'afil bi'achid, that if you are reading Megillah on its proper date, in its proper time, then you don't need 10 people. Rashi says because there's already Pirsumei Nisa built into the fact that everyone around the world, or almost everyone around the world, is reading Megillah on that date. Again, unless you live in a different city, but basically that's the date for Purim, so you don't need 10 if you're reading it in its proper time, as opposed to if you're reading it Shlo Bismana, you do need 10, and Rav Asi thinks you always need 10. And the Gemara discusses this a little bit. Okay, then we go on to the second Mishnah. Ezohi Ir Gdolah, so a big city is a city that has 10 people who don't do anything. We talk about what you can move Megillah earlier, but not later, but other things get moved later and not earlier. So Zman Etzei Kohanim, if it's your job to bring the wood for the Kohanim to burn on the Mizbeach, Tisha B'Av, Chagiga, which is the Yom Tov offering, Hakel, which is this gathering that happens every 7 years for the king to read the Torah. All these things you push later and not earlier. And then it talks about moving Megillah reading earlier and not later. But we don't necessarily push the Isur of Hesped and Ta'anit earlier. And then we have a repeat of the Rabbi Yehuda idea, which we already saw mentioned earlier, that you only move Megillah reading earlier at all in a place where people actually go into the big cities on Monday and Thursday. The Gemara then tells us, again, an idea we've already covered, that yes, the 10 people who do nothing are 10 people who sit and make a minyan in the Beit Knesset. Then the Gemara discusses Makdimin velo ma'achrin, things that you move earlier rather than later. So we don't move Megillah reading later because of the verse velo ya'avor. We don't move bad things earlier, like Tisha B'Av. And we don't move things earlier, I skipped. First, we have this thing about not counting. When we count years in halacha, we count it by months, and when we count months in halacha, we count it by days, not by hours. Then we go, and we have proof text for both of those. Then we go back to this idea of what you can move earlier and later. So you don't move Tisha B'Av earlier because it's a negative thing. We don't move negative things earlier, and we don't move Chagiga and Hakel earlier because we can't. Its chiyuv just hasn't kicked in yet. You're not obligated to do it yet. We don't have a special establishment of earlier dates for those like we do for Megillah, so you can't move those earlier. And then there's this whole discussion of Zman Chagiga versus Chagiga. I wouldn't worry too much about the different positions here, but it is important to know about whether or not you can offer sacrifices on Yom Tov. So Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel have a machloket about that. Mevi'in shlamim b'Yom Tov ve'in somchin alehen. Aval lo olo to Beit Hillel mevi'in shlamim ve'olo v'somchin alehen. The difference is whether you can do smicha on Yom Tov, this sort of leaning on the animal, and whether you can bring all kinds of korbanot or just some kinds. And the Gemara, again, discusses all the different possible meanings. There are multiple answers here for what you can and can't do, what has to be pushed off after the Yom Tov. Even for the last case here, as I said, even for Shavuot, you can push things off, even though, unlike Sukkot and Pesach, it doesn't have its own Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Elazar, in the name of Rabbi Chanina, tells the story of Rebbe planting on Purim. So then we have this whole discussion of the possibility that Purim will be a Yom Tov. Now we're on Hey Amud Bet. Apparently that was initially the thought, Simcha u'Mishtav v'Yom Tov, that's written in the Megillah, but it was not widely accepted and eventually fell out of practice. So we do not treat Purim as a Yom Tov today. We don't have Hesped and Ta'anit, but we don't have an Isur Malacha. And that's basically what this story takes us through. We go back then to Gufa, Chizkiah, Kari, B'Tveria, Be'Arbesar, Uvecham Esar. Chizkiah reads in Tveria on the 14th and the 15th because he's unsure whether it counts as a walled city or not. The Gemara discusses this. Turns out it's not because he doesn't know whether or not there's a wall, but because he's unsure of the Megillah's definition of walled cities, because it uses the word prazim. Not clear what that means. Maybe it means that it has to be fully protected, or maybe it means it has to be fully walled, right? So hani miglu v'hani lo miglu, v'hanami miglaya, odil mamishum dahani mignu v'hani lo mignu, v'hanami mignaya. That's sort of the key phrase there, right? Tveria is open, it's exposed, like unwalled cities, but it is protected like walled cities because it has the water on one side. From there, we get into this discussion of place names and how one name can really mean another place. Tzipori and Reket. You have sort of cute things that the Gemara does with names, calling it different things. So, right, Reket. Tzipori is called Reket because it hangs down like the bank of a river. Goes on to talk about, again, more potential synonyms. I'm not going to take you through all of it. It's called Reket because Tveria is called Reket because even the emptiest people there are full of mitzvot like a rimon. Reket is the real name, and Tveria is what it's called because it sits in the middle, Tzibura shel Eretz Yisrael. So all these different cute things. We keep going with place names for quite a while. We have the story of Naphtali complaining, and we think that means that Naphtali doesn't have Tzipori, but ultimately Naphtali does have Tzipori. Then we go into this part about messianic place names, or what will happen to places in the time of Mashiach. Things will be good for the Jews then. The Avodah Zarah will be uprooted, but Karkasot and Teatrot, right, the theaters and the circuses will be places for Jews to learn. And that will all be good, and that will be good in the future. And then we get into this sort of aside from Rabbi Yitzchak, two things. First of all, I'm going to go up a little bit. Nope, starting from here. Sorry, this is the first piece from Rabbi Yitzchak. This is just talking more about Esav. Esav is really bad, Edom is really bad, and will ultimately sort of fall away, but right now it's good that God keeps them in check. Here's the thing about Rabbi Yitzchak I was thinking about. Yagati v'lo matzati al ta'amen, lo yagati u'matzati al ta'amen, yagati u'matzati ta'amen. So certain things require hard work. You should only believe a person if they say, I worked hard, and then it worked out for me. I worked and I found. But he says that applies specifically to Divrei Torah. And it applies specifically to Lach Jude, to sharpening your Divrei Torah, not just to Ukmei Girsa, not just to like knowing Torah or understanding Torah. That's just Siyata Dishmaya, but if you want to improve your Torah knowledge, that needs hard work. And then he talks about a Rasha. You shouldn't, if you see a Rasha, things are going well for him, basically you shouldn't get in his way, you shouldn't argue with him unless maybe you're a Tzadik Gamor. And the end of that section says, yeah, and maybe even then not, since Sha'am Misacheket Lo, things are going well for him, maybe you want to not get in his way at all. And then we have this little section right before the next Mishnah, Amar Ula, about Italia Shel Yavan, just basically saying what a great city it is. Next Mishnah, you read Megillah in the first Adar, not knowing there's going to be a second Adar, and then Nitzeh B'Ra Hashanah, it's made into a leap year, a month is added. So then you should read it B'Adar Sheni. You should read Megillah again in Adar Sheni. There's no difference between first Adar and second Adar except for Kriyat HaMegillah U'Matanot Lev, meaning all the mitzvot that can be done in Adar Bet can also be done in Adar Aleph, except for Kriyat HaMegillah U'Matanot Lev, those have to be done again in Adar Bet. The Gemara then says, well, that means, this implies that when it comes to Seder Parshiot, the two are the same. Seder Parshiot are the 4 Parshiot that are read in the month of Adar. They are Parshat Shkalim, Parshat Parah, Parshat Zachor, and Parshat HaChodesh. And they have to be read in the month of Adar. And the Gemara says, well, it must be that you can read those in either month. Matnitin Mani, the Gemara asks who our Mishnah matches with. It's about to quote a Breita, and it's going to say that it doesn't think that actually our Mishnah matches with any of the opinions in the Breita. I would get the general gist here, but not worry too much about who says what. The Gemara then has a question about the Breitza. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Hainu Tanakama, aren't they the same person? Or not the same person, but don't they have the same position in the Breitza? And Rav Papa says, Seder Parshiot Ika Beinaihu. There is between them, the difference between them is Seder Parshiot, and Rav Papa re-explains each of the positions in our Breitza to also account for how each Tana thinks about Seder Parshiot, about the 4 Parshiot that you have to read in Adar. The Gemara then goes back to the question of Mani, who does our Mishnah match with, explains why it doesn't seem to match with any of the positions in the Breita, but then ultimately gives 2 answers. Maybe our Mishnah matches with the Tanakama, or maybe our Mishnah matches with Rashbag, and explains that. And then the end of this section here, or sort of the end, Hilchat Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, like Rashbag, who the Gemara has previously said actually could match with our Mishnah. Everything really has to be done in the 2nd month of Adar, but both months have a restriction against Hesped and Tanit. So even Seder Parshiot really has to be done in the 2nd month of Adar, and for sure the mitzvah of Purim, but both months have a restriction against Hesped and Tanit, against eulogies and fasting. Then Rabbi Yochanan explains where the different positions come from in terms of psukim, either B'chol Shana V'Shana or Igeret HaPurim Hazot HaShenit. Igeret HaPurim Hazot HaShenit, the 2nd Purim letter, also according to the Gemara on the very next Amud on Zayin Amud Aleph, implies that Shushan was that Purim was first established only in Shushan and was then established for the entire world. That gets us up to here. Then we have Amar of Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Shachal Lahem Esther L'Chachamim, so this conversation in which Esther tells the Chachamim, please make me a holiday forever. They argue back, but obviously she won that fight. Then a different version in which Esther says, please write my story down in Tanakh, Katvuni L'Dorot. And they say, no, it's already in Tanakh 3 times. In Shemot, I think it quotes them all here. No, it doesn't. Shemot, Dvarim, and Shmuel. And she says, no, but you should write it down. And they say, okay, fine. They find a way to make it so that we can count it as only 2 times so far in Tanakh, so then we can add a 3rd time, and that's Megillat Esther. The next conversation in the Gemara is about whether or not Esther is mitzameat hayadayim, whether it is functionally part of Tanakh for the purposes of making a person's hands impure. The Gemara questions what Shmuel really says here, whether or not it was said B'Ruach HaKodesh, and talks about other texts that are of questionable status or were at one time. Shir HaShirim, Kohelet, Root, each one of these things, there are reasons to think it shouldn't be included in Tanakh, even though, of course, all of them are, ultimately. Then the Gemara goes more deeply into this idea of whether or not Esther was said with Ruach HaKodesh. Esther B'Ruach HaKodesh Ne'amra, and there are all these different proof texts that explain, each Tana says, this is how we prove that Esther was really said B'Ruach HaKodesh. That's all a Breita. Then we have an answer from Shmuel. Shmuel is not in the Breita. He's an Amora, but he says, Ihavai Hatam, if I was there, this is what I would have said. And Rava then says, oh yeah, Shmuel's answer was the best of all. Each answer has a question, but Shmuel's answer has no question. And then we get a few more answers, again, all to prove that Esther really was said with Ruach HaKodesh. Umatanot Levyonim, next phrase from the Mishnah. There's a discussion of how Mishalach Manot work. You have to send 2 manot to 1 person. Matanot Levyonim, you have to send 2 gifts to 2 people. And then there are some stories going on now to Zayin Amud Bet. There are some stories of rabbis giving Mishalach Manot to other rabbis and how that worked out. Then there's a statement that you have to get drunk on Purim. Rava says you have to drink on Purim, at least maybe not drunk, but till you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. And the Gemara then goes on to tell the story about Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Zera. It didn't work out so well. Rabbi got drunk, killed Rabbi Zera, brought him back to life, but still the message seems to be drinking can be dangerous. And the Gemara then follows that up with a discussion about Purim Suda and says basically that you should have Purim Suda at night on Purim and not during the day. Then we get to the second to last Mishnah. Ein ben Yom Tov Shabbat ela ochel nefesh bilvad. On Shabbat you cannot prepare food, and meaning cook, bake. And on Yom Tov you may cook and bake. Ochel nefesh, cooking food, basically. The Gemara says, well, that means that for machshirei ochel nefesh, the preparations for cooking food, like making pots or shechting meat, they must be the same, meaning it must be forbidden on both. The Gemara explores whose position is reflected in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda does not reflect our Mishnah as Rabbi Yehuda is quoted in the Breita, but maybe the Tanna Kamma does, and the Gemara explores their reasoning. There's a pasuk in Shemot Yud Bet, you can see it on the side here. They're deriving their reasoning from Ach asher yachel, right? Lo yaseh behem ach asher yachel. You can only do on holidays that which you will eat. So that's a pasuk that's being discussed here. As I said in class, there's not a lot there, but you should make sure you understand about Ochel Nefesh and Machshiri Ochel Nefesh, and are familiar with the verse that these things get learned out from. Next Mishnah, Ein ben Shabbat liyom kippurim el shezeh zeduno b'dei adam v'zeh zeduno b'karet. There's no difference between Shabbat and Yom Kippur, except that for one, purposeful transgression gets punished by people, and the other, meaning Yom Kippur, purposeful transgression gets punished by karet, which is bidei shamayim, a divine punishment. So this means, according to the Gemara, halin tashlumin zev v'zeh shavin. Regarding the matter of tashlumin, they are equal. Tashlumin means paying someone back if you damage their property while simultaneously transgressing Shabbat and Yom Kippur. So in either case, in either Shabbat or Yom Kippur, since the punishment for the transgression will be greater, you don't have to pay the person back for the monetary damage. Mani Manitzin, the Gemara then asks, well, okay, who does our Mishnah match with? And explores that a little bit. There is a position that says that if you are chayav karet, but you get malkot, right, somebody gives you malkot, gives you lashes, then you're off the hook for the karet. And the Gemara says, well, that doesn't really match with our Mishnah, because then you've kind of erased the difference, right? The person with karet gets punished by people, and the person with skila, the punishment for transgressing Shabbat on purpose, gets punished by people. So you've erased that difference, right? The Ela shezeh zeduno b'dei adam v'zeh zeduno b'karet, they wind up both getting punished by people. And the Gemara says, fine, but not everybody thinks that. Some people think you can't get, namely Rabbi Yitzchak thinks you can't get malkot for karet. And then at the very end, the Gemara says, well, actually, even if you want to say that you could get malkot and that gets you off the hook for karet, it's still the case that ikar zeduno b'dei adam and ikar zeduno b'hikaret, right? Like sort of l'chachila, or the way we talk about it, right? The idea is that you would get karet for transgressing Yom Kippur and skila for transgressing Shabbat. So the distinction is at least preserved in theory, if not actually in practice. Okay, that's the end of your review video. Please do contact me with any questions.